Hello everyone. In this video, I'll explain the Entra PowerShell module, which is recently released by Microsoft. First, I will provide the detailed explanation with examples and then show how to install and use Entra PowerShell module in the lab. Let's start with what is Entra PowerShell module. So Entra PowerShell module is built on top of Microsoft Graph SDK, with which you can manage Azure Active Directory, which is Entra ID now, and other identity related services like privilege identity management, conditional access, etc. And this Entra PowerShell module is launched as a part of Microsoft Entra Suite, which provides a comprehensive IAM solutions. Now the another question is, how was Entra ID managed before the release of this module? So if we'll go few years back, there was Azure Active Directory PowerShell module. And at that time, Entra ID was called as Azure Active Directory. So in this PowerShell module, you can manage the Active Directory resources, user management, group management, creation of application, or the service principals. All those can be managed easily with Azure Active Directory PowerShell module. The problem with Azure Active Directory PowerShell module was that it was not very efficient. So it had performance issues when used on scale. There were more features being added to Azure Active Directory, and those features were not supported, like conditional access policies or multi-factor authentication. And the main reason to introduce Microsoft Graph PowerShell SDK was to provide uniform level of support for all the different Microsoft services. Microsoft launched some Microsoft 365 online services like SharePoint Online, Intune, Office 365, and all those services were not supported using Azure Active Directory PowerShell module. So if someone is creating a user, they can only create a user in Azure Active Directory. And if someone has to create a user in Office 365, then they have to use Microsoft Graph PowerShell APIs. So to make it uniform, Microsoft deprecated Azure AD PowerShell module. And along with that, the performance of using the Microsoft Graph at scale increased significantly. So it provided a more consistent and robust experience. Now another question is, if everything was working so well, then why Microsoft introduced Entra PowerShell module, Azure Active Directory, as well as another services, if they all can be managed using Microsoft Graph PowerShell APIs? And these were the main four reasons why Microsoft introduced Entra PowerShell module. First is user experience enhancements. Another one is granular permission management. Then the migration support and scenario focused management. Let's check each one of them one by one. So the first one, user experience enhancements. So the Entra PowerShell provides more intuitive and human readable parameters. Let's check the user creation example. If you use the Graph SDK, you can use new MG user, account enabled true, display name, it's pretty clear, Shailendra Chaudhary, mail nickname. Now, if someone has to create a user, they need to understand or they need to learn all these parameters. User principal name, password profile, force change password next sign in. So using this command, you can create a new user, provide the password, and force them to change the password in the first sign in. Now in Entra module, it becomes more simpler. New Entra user, enabled is equal to true, name, alias. So if you're providing the alias name, previously it was mail nickname, which is very difficult to remember. Now it's alias, it's understandable. If you use the help command, you can understand that easily alias is what has to be provided. It's the alias for the name. And the user principal name, UPN, password, and force change password. And now you can clearly see the new module is human readable and easy to use. And the another reason is granular permission management. So in the Entra PowerShell modules, you can manage the permission at the different scope levels. Let's take an example. If you are creating a user, then you have to provide the scope. Then the scope will be slash, which means at the root level. However, if you're doing the same role assignments in Entra PowerShell module, you can define the scope here, either root or the subscription level, resource group level. So based on the management perspective, now the role assignments are more flexible and granular. And you don't have to assign the role to a user at a root level scope. So this is also one of the reasons why Microsoft had to introduce Entra PowerShell module. Now the third reason is scenario-based management. Graph PowerShell API provides one-to-one mapping, which means every time you're running a command, it has its different parameters and different naming conventions. And it's not very scenario based. So let's take a scenario. We are creating a new user, adding it to a group, and assigning the role to the user within a group. Now, in the case of Graph APIs, create a new user. We have already seen this command. It's a big command. Then find the group ID, because you can't assign the user directly with the group name. Then you have to look for the group ID. So you have to remember these commands. Then you have to add user to the group using the group ID. And finally, assign a role to the user within the group. And this is also a big command, as you can clearly see. However, in the case of Entra PowerShell module, you can create a new user using the command which we have seen in the previous slide. Then add the user to the group using the group name itself. As you can see, my group is the name. Provide the group name and you can easily add the user to the group. And finally, assign the role. And here you have to provide significantly less parameters for assigning the role to a user within the group. So in short, the difference is Graph PowerShell APIs are not scenario based. They have one-to-one mapping. However, in the case of Entra PowerShell module, they are scenario based. So they support different scenarios. So if a user has to be added to the group, so it can be directly added using the group name, and the role assignments is pretty much easy as compared to the Graph APIs. And this is one of the reason why Microsoft brought Entra PowerShell module. Now moving to the last one, which is migration support. When Microsoft deprecated previous Azure AD module and introduced the Graph PowerShell SDK, there was no migration support as such. And because there is a complete different naming convention, the command line is entirely different. So it was very difficult for the organization to switch from Azure AD scripts to Microsoft Graph scripts. But now with the release of Entra PowerShell module, it provides 98% compatibility with the deprecated Azure AD module. So now using the new module, you can migrate your scripts which are running in the deprecated version to the newer version. You can support the new features of Azure Active Directory or Entra ID. And along with this, there is interoperability between Microsoft Graph SDK as well as Entra PowerShell module. So you can use them side by side. And the one feature which is really important is the alias activation. So once you'll run this command, enable Entra Azure AD alias, you can activate the alias. And once it's activated, and you can run the Azure AD deprecated commands as well. And the Entra PowerShell module will understand all those commands and provide you the output. So when you are migrating the scripts from deprecated Azure AD module to Entra PowerShell module, you don't need to make a significant changes. Just enable the alias and 98% of the script will work. There are certain features which have changed. You need to make slight changes and you're good to go. So the last question is, should you install the Entra PowerShell module? Should you use in your environment? And the answer is depends. And in case there are a whole lot of scripts which you haven't migrated from deprecated Azure Active Directory module to Microsoft Graph, then yes, it will be very beneficial for you because now you can migrate to Entra PowerShell module and add the new features like conditional access policies, privilege identity management to your scripts. And for the people who are already using Microsoft Graph, there is an interoperability. So you can use both of them parallelly. And it completely depends whether you want to use the command line of Microsoft Graph to manage the Entra ID, or you can use the Entra PowerShell module. So if you're comfortable with the Microsoft Graph APIs, then you don't need this Entra PowerShell module. Otherwise, it's a good add-on, which was much needed for a long time. So now we have understood the Entra PowerShell module with examples. So let's check this in lab how to install and how to use Entra PowerShell module. I'm running PowerShell 7 as an admin, and now I'll start the installation of Entra PowerShell module. As you know, Entra PowerShell module is built on top of Graph module, but there is a problem with the stable version, which is 1.0 version. There is another version which is available, which is beta version, which has more features. However, it's not recommended for the production. But in this case, looks like there is some issue with the stable version. So I'll install the beta version and show all the different commands for the Entra ID as well as its support for the previous Azure AD PowerShell module. So let's first check if Entra PowerShell module is installed or not. So get installed module and we are looking for Entra beta. It's not installed. So let's install it now. So install module, Microsoft Graph Entra beta. It's in preview, so you have to allow the pre-release, and repository is PowerShell gallery, and forcefully it will install it. There are multiple packages which needs to be installed before installing the Graph Entra, like Graph Authentication, Graph Users, and first those packages will be installed, and then Microsoft Graph Entra beta will be installed. So let's wait for the installation to finish, and I'll be back. It took a couple of minutes, and Entra PowerShell module is installed. So let's check what are the different graph packages which are installed along with the Entra module. So these are all the different packages like graph authentication, application, users. So all these packages are installed, and the Entra beta, it's in preview. However, if you'll install the Microsoft Graph Entra only version 1.0, it's also in preview. But because of the issue, I'm installing the beta version. Now let's check how many different commands does it support. So using the get command for the module, you can see what are the different commands it supports. So these are the list of the commands which are supported. And using these commands, you can manage your Entra ID. And the next step is to provide authentication and grant permissions. So we'll use the command connect Entra. Let's run the command connect Entra. So I have already ran the command and I got the tenant ID from Entra ID, which is here. This is the tenant ID in the overview page of your Entra. You can copy the tenant ID. Now let's run this command. And the scope is user read all so that it can read the user info. Now it's asking me to sign in. I'll quickly sign in now. I have to grant the permissions, read all the user full profile, and maintain access to the data. So once the authentication is done, if we'll go back to enterprise applications, there is one application with the name Microsoft Graph. So Microsoft Graph command line tools. And if we'll go in the permissions in the security, you can see that user read all permissions is provided. So let's go back to our PowerShell and run get entra. Instead of the user, we have to use beta user because that's the command. And it's showing me all the three users. Let's quickly go back to our Entra ID and go to the users. And I have only three users, which you can see from here. So let's check whether the deprecated Azure Active Directory commands are running or not. Get Azure AD user. So this command is not recognized because the Active Directory module is not installed. But as you know, there is a alias support which is available, which we have to activate. And once it's activated, you can run the deprecated commands. And this makes it very easy to migrate our scripts from deprecated Azure Active Directory module to the new Entra PowerShell module. Select activate aliasing. It's enabled, and let's run the above command again. And perfect. You can see now, and you can run the deprecated commands without even installing that module. So now if you have any scripts running the previous module, you can just activate the aliasing and then most of your script, 98% of the script will run. So that's all for this video, where I explained in depth about the Entra PowerShell module and then showed in lab how we can install the Entra PowerShell module and activate aliasing. I hope you liked this video. Thank you so much.